Do you want to know how to get started doing a podcast, particularly in health technology? In this episode, I speak to Dr. James Somauroo, who's been doing just that. He changed from doing medicine to starting a podcast, as well as his business called Somex, and talking all about health technology and sharing his journey in this episode about how you can do all of that. And to be honest, it's a really good chat. So definitely join us. If you do find this episode useful, please leave us a like below and a comment to let me know what you think of it. Always like to hear about that. And as always, subscribe. And remember, EGP Learning is here to help save you and your patients time by tech enhancing your primary care and learning. Shall we begin? Hey, GP learners. So in this episode, I'm joined by James Somauroo of Healthtech Podcast and Somex. How are we doing there, James?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problems. So I know I wanted to get you to join us because actually I've been an avid listener of your podcast for particularly the past 3 or 4 months now in particular. And I know you do some amazing work talking to various different companies and things about health tech. And it's an area that I've not really found many people have gone into. So it's nice having a reasoned and sensible voice just talking about this stuff in particular. But I know speaking to a lot of my EGP learners and stuff, a lot of them are interested in terms of how people have got into things like podcasting and also the health tech space. So definitely wanted to hear your perspective of kind of how you got started, where you went, and basically what you've been up to, really.
Yeah, sure. I can definitely give you the rundown. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try and keep it relatively short. Yeah, so my name's James. I'm an anaesthetics IT doctor by background, so I practiced clinically for 5 years. Did lots of bits and bobs in like policy after that. So did a stint at NHS England and Health Education England, and had a role at the BMJ as well,
Mhm.
designing and doing some stuff with some education products, which was cool. So always had one eye kind of in medicine and out of medicine. And when I was in medicine and practicing as a doctor, I was very much into quality improvement projects because I really enjoyed fixing problems that weren't patients, basically, because I saw the fact that a printer being broken caused so many issues, excuse me, with like people queuing up at 8 a.m. to print their lists, and then ward rounds getting delayed and patients not getting fed and then not going to surgery. Like I could see the knock-on effects of stuff, and it gave me a lot of joy to solve those types of problems. And so I then, as kind of a progression, I shadowed people in finance in the hospital, which not many people did, and tried to shadow the chief exec and things like that to see how the back end of the hospital worked. And it was through that I learned how to write a business case. And then I suddenly realized that, like, well, hey, look, if you write this thing called a business case, everybody stands up and listens, and you can actually get stuff bought, which is going to solve problems for hospitals and things like that. So kind of graduated up to doing that sort of stuff. I can remember like following blood cultures around hospitals to see where on earth they went, and ending up writing a business case to stick a new blood culture analyzer on one of the neonate wards, and like stuff to discharge babies quicker. So stuff like that, and really got my teeth stuck in that way. And so I suppose I learned to love the business side of it and fixing problems and solving problems. And I think as a progression, that led me to technology, because even when I was a practicing clinician, I was speaking to technology companies to figure out how they could bring their technology into the ward, the department, the hospital, the GP practice. Like, I was always speaking to them to figure that stuff out. So I was always kind of straddling those two worlds. And I suppose learning the languages of those two worlds, and I became this kind of communicator between the two worlds to say, like, oh, okay, we need to discharge patients quicker in this hospital because the discharge summaries are piling up in the doctor's mess. Well, actually, I know this tech company that could come in and maybe just have a focus group with us and figure this out and put that stuff together and saw it work. So that's kind of how it all got started. Anyway, as I say, took a few years out in a couple of years out in policy, but then I suppose I was enjoying learning that back end of medicine and the impact that I could possibly have. And they launched this thing at the time called the Digital Health, excuse me, Digital Health London Accelerator,
Mhm.
which was a program, an accelerator, which helps startups, and it helps technology startups. And so they launched this accelerator. It was run by the AHSNs in London and NHS England at the time, and MedCity and a few other people. And I started there as something called a navigator, which wasn't really a job title. They didn't really know what we would be doing.
Mhm.
But I was looking after 10 startups, like basically an account manager for 10 of those startups. Like Perfect Ward and Doctor and Echo and people like that have been on that accelerator. And so again, it was just helping them get into the NHS by any means necessary, using contacts, using knowledge, helping them with their pitch decks or their websites, or giving them introductions to people that we knew. And it was through that really that I guess I saw loads of impact being made by this quite new concept, and always walking that knife edge of like private business with the public sector, and where does that go, where does that fit, and it felt at the time like we were almost having those conversations for the first time. That was a few years ago now,
Mhm.
and it was just really interesting to see, and even now to have seen since then, health tech and innovation through startups is like, yeah, that's fine, that's normal. But at the time, there was a lot of resistance. We'd meet with these CIOs, CCIOs, chief execs of trusts, and they'd be like, "You're trying to privatize," and like all these things, which now seem ludicrous. Like, you don't make the electricity in the basement; you pay the grid. Like,
Mhm.
in the same way that you don't have to make your own electronic health record; you can get it from a startup. Like, it's okay. Because it saves money and it's more efficient and all these different things. But we were having this conversation the first time, but I was seeing loads of impact. And anyway, again, to cut a long story short, I ended up running that program for 12 months, and it was really cool. Loved it. Started my own accelerator after that, called HS, which became HS Ventures. That was with a guy called Alex.
Mhm.
And we ended up partnering with various bits and bobs in the health tech ecosystem and piecing that stuff together. Anyway, alongside all of this stuff, I started writing for Forbes on health tech because I enjoyed writing,
Mhm.
and communication has always been a thread through everything that I've done, with communicating between the tech world and the health world and the investment world and the startup world, and communicating to all these different people and distilling messages and all that sort of stuff's always been something that I've been quite good at. So yeah, I started writing for Forbes, started the Health Tech podcast, which grew very well. I say very quickly in popularity. We can come to that, but has grown in popularity now after a
Mhm.
couple of years. And I posted my metrics the other day just for anybody that's under any illusion that it was an overnight success, because for 17 weeks nobody listened, and then only now do I get 8,000 downloads a month. But yeah, because of that stuff, I was then helping lots of startups with comms, PR, podcasting, media,
Mhm.
even press releases because of Forbes and things like that. And that has now turned into its own company called Somex. And what we do at Somex, we're comms, PR, media company that helps specifically health tech companies, so startups, funds, accelerators, corporates, but helping them with the usual press and PR, but also the modern side, the video, the podcasting, the content, and the social media as well. And so we sort of thrown all that offer together. I'd call it soft launched, obviously not in stealth because I'm saying what it is now, but I'd say soft launched as to what we are at the moment, just helping out a few clients here and there, over delivering, and trying to bed ourselves in the ecosystem for a full launch next year.
Cool. And how have you found that experience? I mean, working with these different partners and stuff in terms of trying to help them understand the complexity, I guess, of modern PR and that kind of thing.
It's a good question, and I think a prerequisite of working with me and us in Somex at the moment is the fact that you've got to buy into the power of content. You've got to buy into the fact that getting an article in the Times or the Telegraph is fine, and it will hit certain goals, but there's so many yards that can be made up in between those punctuation marks of press releases through distributing your content in the right places at the right times and by the right times all the time. And so through any means necessary. It's why, at the moment I've got my Forbes audience, I've got my health tech Pidgeon, the newsletter, I've got that audience. I've got like my LinkedIn audience, Twitter, like
Yeah.
podcast, like all these different audiences, right? Because people absorb content in different ways. And so
Mhm.
for me to be on the map, I suppose, of all those different people, when I think about the impact that I want to make in the health tech ecosystem, I've got to get people wherever they absorb information. And so it's through all of those different means. And so distributing that content everywhere is, as I say, a prerequisite of working with us. And I think that is the modern way of doing things. No longer do we, I said this on podcast the other day, like no longer do most people, sit in front of the TV at 7:30 to watch on demand now, wherever they want. They're not kind of taking it from one place anymore. And so you have to be in all those places quite contextually as well. It's changing what you do for all those different platforms is so important to capture everyone. And so working with us is all about doing that stuff. And I think by buying in and almost letting us take the wheel and just going with it and being a bit uncomfortable with the things that you're doing. A lot of clients don't feel like they're worthy of doing a podcast. A lot of clients feel like, oh, what if nobody listens?
Mhm.
And it's like, well, you're doing it for more reasons than just people listening every week. You're doing it because it's a bank of content in audio form. You wouldn't question doing a blog that nobody reads because it looks good on your website, but for whatever reason you question doing a podcast that nobody listens to or the odd person listens to. But it's because that, who knows, in 6 months' time, you might be going for investment, and an investor looks at your website, they see that you've got a podcast, they listen to 12 episodes in a row, they've got way further than they would have done in 12 meetings because they've just listened to everything that you've got to say. And they know they know that you know your stuff. And so that bank of content available for people is so important. And so that's why I consider content so valuable, because at the end of the day as well, you think about health tech being sort of a few years behind other sectors with lots of different things. And I think that kind of is true. And you just look at the people that are doing this and how fast ahead they are going. You look at, the podcast that I've got, Peter Birch and Talking Health Tech in Australia. He's now building an entire ecosystem around what he's doing in Australia. It's becoming a business. And so by being first through the door, I think so much can be done. There's so much ground to be made by the people in health tech that do this first. And that's what we're helping people to do, essentially.
Absolutely. So I guess with creating all that content and things, you clearly have focused on the podcast element of things and the audio. I mean, how have you found that journey? It's been an interesting one, to say the least.
Yeah, as I sort of alluded to before, like, it starts off with nobody listening. It starts off with an idea. I started the podcast when I was doing the second accelerator with Alex, and I actually didn't want to do the podcast to begin with. I just thought, it's another thing I'm gonna have to do. It's another expenditure of my time. But by doing it, you realize you kind of hit far more goals than, as I say, getting listeners. That's not the actual goal. What ended up happening is that you end up having a very focused hour-long conversation per week, if you do it weekly, with somebody, in my case, in health tech, in someone in the field. And even that is a win, because even if nobody listens, you've had a valuable conversation with somebody, an entrepreneur, someone that's interesting, and you've asked them questions, and you've got a learning experience there. And I think people forget that. People think that a podcast is just all about getting listeners and getting eyeballs and ears on them and everything that's going to happen and make them famous and all that sort of stuff. But really, at its core, if nobody listened to my podcast, I'd still have a conversation with somebody in health tech for an hour a week. So I might as well just be recording it. Like, you know what I mean? And then I think, as I say, nobody listened for 17 weeks. Frankly, it was for a few different reasons. There was very little distribution. The health tech wasn't as big of a thing at the time. Like, lots of different reasons that nobody was listening. But at the same time, it just became about consistency. There was the odd weeks that we wouldn't do one and all that sort of stuff. But then it was probably, like 18 months ago, turn of that year, that it was like, just going to do this consistently. And Alex and I did it together to begin with. I basically just started doing it myself after that, and I just stayed consistent and had those conversations. Then gradually people get in touch and ask to be on the podcast. There were interesting little spikes, which at the time looked like massive spikes, and now I just get that fluctuation weekly. But like at the time, interviewed someone from Babylon, that's someone that everybody knows, and you get a few more listeners, and they go back and listen to all your old episodes, and then they might recommend it to a couple of people. And that's the thing, with the long tail of the internet, give it time. No matter what you're talking about, you're going to find the audience eventually. They're going to share it if it's valuable. And I think that's basically what the journey was for me. It was just consistency, getting these little spikes that shot us up, and then we landed down like at a higher level. And it's been that the whole way through. I released my metrics the other day on LinkedIn and just basically said, like, it's about consistency. I've done 2 episodes a week for a year and an episode a week for a year before that. Like, it really is about that. I think the opportunity that's come out of it has been huge, as well as, I suppose, the skills that have come out of it have been huge for me, because at the end of the day, it's now part of the Somex offering that we offer a white labeled podcast service for people. And so that has been something I've been able to monetize even, and charge other people to help them with. me as a speaker, me as an interviewer, I've really learnt to love interviewing. I've learnt to love speaking. I've become better at it. I don't and as much as I did before. I don't have as many verbal tics, because once you've listened to yourself back for 100 hours, like, you irritate yourself in all these different ways. So, like, as you well know,
Especially if you're editing it as well, you definitely understand it if you're going through that process as well.
especially if you're editing it as well, because at the end of the day, you want to make your edit as easy as possible. And so if you're
Yeah.
umming and ahhing and you need to edit all of those things out, you will learn very quickly that that is extra work. And so you don't end up doing that, because it makes things easier. But anyway, so yeah, it's been a super interesting journey. I mean, now, look, I also did a few like little tips and tricks, like things like, always putting episodes out on LinkedIn and always saying who I've interviewed, why I found it interesting, trying to communicate the value to people and give them a reason to listen through social media. And, again, consistently putting that out weekly. You'd miss the odd week, that's okay, but you put that out 1-2 times a week. And over time, that kind of upgrades as well. Like now I do like audiograms and quote cards and that sort of stuff, so people can absorb that in different ways and have a reason to listen. So there's getting guests as well, which, I gradually increased my outreach to get guests, but now it's mostly inbound as well, and so it becomes a bit easier. I now have an editor to do the editing for me as well, so that gets a bit easier. So over time, it does get easier as your attention gets drawn elsewhere, because it starts to, I suppose, work for you and work for me. It allows me to have those conversations. There's hundreds of hours of context out there for everybody and anybody that wants to understand me or what I do, or the business, or if they want to be a client. There's loads that they can hear about me. So that seems to work in my favor. But yeah, as I say, I'd encourage anyone to do it, not for the listeners and not for the big wins at the end, but at the end of the day, if you're in a sector and you want to learn more about the sector, or you want to immerse yourself even further, or you just want to have an interesting conversation a week, just start a podcast, because it's the easiest meeting you'll ever get in the world by asking someone to come on your podcast. It really is. Yeah.
Absolutely agree. And I think you mentioned there in terms of the key things when it comes to doing this. So number one, consistency is an absolute must, because, the whole point of having like podcasts and that kind of stuff is that people are then expecting to hear from you, and that's how you build the listenership and stuff. So yeah, fair enough. You may miss the odd week or so here and there. But regular consistency helps to build with that. And that's definitely one thing me and Andy found out. So we initially started off doing it monthly, and like you say, that initially it was like nobody was listening to us at all. And then we kind of figured out that actually we were building a really small audience. But then when we went down to, every couple of weeks, it nearly tripled in the space of a month or so. And it was just that regularity and things. And then in addition, I added in my video work that I was doing, and it's just, it multiplies. It's almost logarithmic at points. And I think the other part is, like you say, it's the content. It's providing content that's useful, but also content that you yourself enjoy. Because if you don't enjoy doing it, you're going to stop. And that's the real challenge with it, is finding stuff that you actually enjoy doing. Because otherwise, yeah, you lose favor. And like you said, it takes time. I was looking back at my video episodes. I realized I've just done over 300 videos in the past couple of years.
Wow.
And, it's just crazy how I now see that, when I started, I was lucky if I got one subscriber a week, if that, and now on average I'm hitting about 10 to 15 a day.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it's just like you say, it's the long tail impact of the internet, isn't it? People find this stuff, and then they find you, and then if they like the content, then it continues, and that's how it builds that authority. I think
Yeah.
key thing. I think podcasts offer the opportunity for people to build authority in the area that they just know. And if you are that kind of person that knows that area and is exploring it and trying to find it, bring people along on that journey with you, and that's the real benefit. I think the work that you've been doing, you've been bringing people along on this journey that you've had in terms of understanding health tech and that kind of stuff, particularly moving away from medicine, which must have been a real challenge. I know many people feel real apprehension about just jumping from one thing to another. I mean, how did that feel for you?
It's interesting. People talk about the jump outside medicine, or taking the plunge and all that sort of stuff. it never really felt like that to me, because that kind of maneuver never made sense to me, because I was risk averse. And even to this day, I'm relatively risk averse. I being an entrepreneur, I suppose you'd call it, but it doesn't really chime with that. And so I definitely have an element of risk that might be higher than some, but I any risk is calculated. And I think it was the same when I left medicine. I didn't leave in this like blaze of glory of just like, dropping the mic and just walking out the hospital and just being like, what on earth am I going to do now? It was pretty measured. I was in core anesthetics training. I'd done the first year, 18 months ish, probably 18 months, and just looked at it and thought, what, I don't think this is me for the next few decades of my life. I don't think that it's going to suit me. I wasn't getting the same joy from everybody else, and so I started to look at other things to do. But that took time. And I think I started to immerse myself in different communities. I already knew the odd tech company and things from all the QI stuff I was doing, and I'd spend more time with them. I'd go to like events. I'd get on more calls with people. I'd start figuring out like, where are the opportunities, and what could I do, and how could I get out of medicine. But anyway, I discovered fellowships. It's long story short. I discovered these like year-long programs that you can jump out of medicine. You can still pretty much be in medicine. So I don't need to tell my dad that I've left medicine, but I kind of have left medicine for a bit. So I took a fellowship. So it was the Faculty of Medical Leadership, National Medical Directors Clinical Fellowship Scheme, or whatever that ludicrously long one is.
Yep.
It was the Bruce Keogh one when I did it, but whoever it is now.
Yep.
Yeah. So it was that I did, and I was at HE for a year, and it was through that again, I had a bit of a 9 to 5. I had some time, but also learned skills. I learned how to send an email. I learned what an office structure is like. Again, what the back end of healthcare is like. And I went into that job thinking, if I work hard and I do well, I'll create opportunity for myself within here. And at least I'll then have a 50-50 choice at the very least of like, do I stay here or do I go back to medicine? And that was that was me giving myself a choice by just going in there and being like, I'm going to show so much value. It turns out policy didn't really chime with me too much, but it was one of those things that I tried my best and worked hard but went on a learning journey and realised that isn't necessarily for me. But it was then that they launched the Digital Health London Accelerator, so it was then that I joined that, and then started doing some bits for NHS England when that came up, because I randomly bumped into Tony Young and had an interesting conversation with him, and he was like, do you want to do some work for me? I was like, cool, I'll do that. He's like, I can't pay you. Fine, like I'll do it. But again, it's to increase opportunity, right? And I think that's the thing. And again, through that, I went to really interesting meetings and really interesting conversations again, and like just increased my experience and increased my opportunity. And so I think that's the theme. It's like it's not just thinking I don't want to do this and then just quitting and leaving and just hoping something's going to land in your lap because you're a doctor and you're amazing. Well, actually, no, you're not, and it won't. Frankly, you need to work twice as hard to then create that opportunity for you. And so that was the mindset I had anyway. Like that's pretty much what I thought, and it ended up working out. I think the biggest fortune that I had was I was because of the fellowship that I was on, we were in a WhatsApp group, and somebody just posted that Digital Health London job and just said, they're launching this thing called an accelerator. It's for startups. Is anybody interested? So it was Manpreet that put it in the WhatsApp group. I can remember standing in my room at the time, my bedroom, just looking at it and going like, that is ideal.
Yeah.
If she hadn't have posted that, if I hadn't have seen it in the WhatsApp group, if I'd not applied, if I'd not done it. And I was interviewing at startups as well. I was interviewing at Babylon. I was interviewing at like a few other of the startups at the time as well, and that was just one of the other interviews that I had when I was spreading my bets. But yeah, like it ended up working out, and it's always a mixture of hard work and luck, right? And I think that's the luck bit. I definitely don't. That certainly wasn't planned, but it seemed ideal and it worked, and that's when I started my own accelerator. But it's a funny one, I suppose. It's never. until recently, I suppose it's always been like, would I go back? And then when COVID-19 hit and then they asked for people to go back, it was like, I'm going to register for this, because if I can do a day a week and it helps and we're in this like, zombie apocalypse, like why not? Obviously didn't end up being like that, and I think I probably would be more dangerous than helpful with the amount of time I've had out. But it was definitely on the agenda for me to go back. It's not as if I hate medicine or anything like that. But I do think if you're looking to do something outside of it, it's just about doing whatever you can to create that opportunity for yourself, which I think is tough. But if it's in health tech, I suppose in some ways getting easier. There's more startups, there's more companies, there's more investment flowing in. It's an economy within itself that's growing. The opportunities are growing. There's more things to do. So there's lots of ways to do it in health tech, definitely.
Okay. I guess with changes in opportunities and changes in, I guess, the way you've been doing things, one of the more interesting ones I've seen lately has been your Healthtech Pidgeon.
Yeah. So Healthtech Pidgeon. It's sort of like the joke department of Somex. So what it was really practically, actually, there's a guy called Mustafa who hosts something called the Big Picture Medicine podcast, and he and I were just chatting, and I was on his podcast, and we were chatting about stuff, and we were talking about doing bits together and what we could do together, and he mentioned, like, why don't you have a newsletter? You don't have a newsletter. And I said, it's on the agenda. It's something that I could do. It's just finding the time. Mm-hmm. And so him and I have been working on that together, basically. And the way that it sort of came about was that I obviously read stuff through the week. So does he. So do a few other people in health tech. And one of my favorite newsletters is the Rock Health one, because it is super short. It is pretty much just the headlines. I can click on whatever I want. I don't have to scroll through reams and reams of stuff. And for those that don't know, Rock Health is a big digital health, I suppose, VC and company and conglomerate in the US, and sort of everything digital health goes through Rock Health. So I really enjoyed their newsletter and just thought there's probably something missing in the UK like that. I think there were a few bits like it, but nothing really like fun and enjoyable that people actually want to read. And I think that's the thing. I only wanted to create a newsletter that I would want to read myself. So it had to be super short. It had to be actually interesting. It wasn't like dull and boring. It had to be this mixture of like the tech world, who's investing in what, but also some fun startup-y stuff and opportunities and jobs and just stuff that people will actually want to be like interested in and interested in reading. And so again, I just wanted a brand for it that was more inviting than it was like draconian or like academic, or the stuff that's I suppose out there at the minute. So yeah, it's funny. I was just looking for how do you name a newsletter, and I was just googling like how do you name a newsletter, and I knew it needed to be health tech something, like, and so I ended up looking at all these websites of like every publication in the world and what things are called, and there's a few that help you name newsletters, and I must have looked through, honestly, like 10,000 different words that you can put on the end of something, like Observer, Times, like all these different things that you can put on the end. And I saw Pidgeon and I was like, that's the one. That is the one. Because then in my head I was like, there can be this little pigeon that's the thing that represents it, and that's the thing that I can stick on key rings and stuff when people share it 100 times and they get a key, that sort of viral stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted it to be a bit of fun, really.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I must admit, I really enjoy getting it every week and stuff and looking at the content. So,
thanks, mate.
Clearly there's a signpost to your latest episode. But then what I also like is there's that additional stuff about other things that you've come across and things. And
yeah,
it's just nice to have something that, like you say, is short, because it makes it easier to, consume and stuff, but then directs you to kind of new kind of thing. So I must admit, it kind of spurred a couple of ideas in my head in terms of how I can adapt something similar for
nice
to be learning. So I'm hoping that's going to come out soon in terms of adjusting things. So I guess that's one of the key things. You're always learning, aren't you, from other people and how it all works effectively to help you. So even though I've been podcasting for about 3-4 years now, I learn every single time. I don't know if you find it as well.
Oh, definitely, like 100%. As you say, that feedback loop of preparing for it or indeed not preparing for it, then doing it, and there's that delta there of like, how did that go? Then there's the obviously the doing it and the asking the questions. Could I have asked that better? Like, am I saying and ah too much? Am I saying this and that too much? There's then the editing bit, and you go through it again there, and especially when you start out. So yeah, there's huge amounts of learning, and I just think, I was speaking to, who was I speaking to the other day about Nada from Ampersand. I was talking to Nada from Ampersand, which is Ampersand Health, a digital health company. I had him on the podcast the other day, and we were talking about learning by doing, and I think he described it as a real feature in the lives of people that are inquisitive. And I think that's the thing, is that you can read about something all day, but until you actually do it, it's like driving. I mean, everyone knows that example. You couldn't learn driving in a book. You couldn't learn it by the first 10 times you drive. You're constantly learning and figuring out, like, and eventually, intuitively, you can spot the driver that's going to cut you up. Intuitively, you know the guy on the motorway that's about to pull over and do something stupid. Like, eventually it just becomes intuitive. And I think that's the same with podcasts. You end up solving so many problems through the podcast, don't you? Like, an example being, the internet connection is not being very good, so you need to like quickly get someone to record locally, or I don't know, they don't turn up on time and you need to change your questioning, or there's lots of different ways or the quality is really bad, they're really echoey, or their microphone's not working. You need to switch that up. You need to see if they've got headphones. Like, there's so many problems that you solve on the fly, but eventually you get to a point where you know how to prepare for all this stuff properly and all the rest of it. But it's like I said before, it just gets you better at so many different skills. I think honestly, how much better, I mean, you might not think I'm that great now, but like the amount better I am at speaking, and even public speaking because of it, is very, very good and much better. And also, as you say, like, just dealing with solving problems, speaking to high profile people as well, that's another one. Used to get quite nervous before doing so, whereas now they're just a person on the end of the microphone, the same as you. Like, they've got their own things going on, and you have these nice normal human chats with people before a podcast as well, which I really enjoy, and it humanizes everybody, and it builds loads of relationships, and everything. It's huge learning.
You mentioned about talking to clearly notable people and stuff. So I guess, who's your unicorn guest? Who's the one that would be, if I got that, I'd
it'd probably be, do you know what, if I'm being totally honest, I'd have to probably say, and I'm not sure how many of your audience would know this person, but I'm sure you will, or you might not, but Gary Vaynerchuk.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I probably owe the entire Somex business model to him. I probably owe my entire earnings to him, to be honest. So, because literally I'll listen to his content in the morning and then execute it in Healthtech in the afternoon. Like, it's that straightforward. Everything that I've said about the power of content, everything I've said about, having clients that really buy into that, is because I've lived that, I've done what he said, and it's worked, and now I do that for others, and that's the information that I'm imparting, and that's the kind of skill set that I've built within the team at Somex that we can deliver for others. And so, just if I could get him on just to say, cheers, mate. That'd be great.
Yeah, and for those people who don't know who Gary Vaynerchuk is, he's effectively like the content creation king, is probably the best way. Anything he kind of looks at, people then start looking at and stuff. So he is probably one of the leaders in terms of content creation and stuff. And even, so my version of that would actually be Pat Flynn. So listening to his stuff, he's the guy that got me into podcasting and stuff. And I know that his kind of similar thing is Gary Vaynerchuk. So the way he just comes up with ideas and stuff is just astronomically amazing.
It's interesting, the fact that, for me, it's almost like, the guy, Gary puts out so much content. I call him Gary as a funny name. Like, Gary Vaynerchuk puts out so much content that it's almost like having a mentor. It's almost like having somebody that's got your back, because they're constantly reinforcing things for you. And he preaches a lot about kindness and empathy in business as well, which are values that I really appreciate. And so there's also that element too. It's not just a straight up, I've copied this dude and therefore, like, I want to speak to him. It's more that, for me, without knowing, he's been, frankly, a mentor. Like, that's the only way that I can describe it, because you can go through all that stuff, and you can get ideas. You can feel better if you're having a bad day. If you've had a bad client meeting, like there'll be content on that. There'll be content on all sorts to do with it. And yeah, I think that I really like, and I think that's another power of content, is that you don't know who you're helping when you're putting it all out. You know, the amount of messages that I'm sure you've got as well as me. I've listened to your podcast and I've had this idea. It's like you just said about the Pigeon, right? Yeah, I've read Pigeon and like I've got these ideas now. It's like, that's so cool to know that you're just putting out those good vibes, and like you're actually just making someone's life slightly better because they've come up with an idea. Like even that's just like feels good to me, you know. It's more fuel. I think it's a feature of most of the people I interview for the podcast, to be honest, in Healthtech, is that most of us are driven by impact, and it's that nice vibes out in the world that creates impact that seems to fuel people more so than necessarily chasing an exit, because frankly chasing an exit in Healthtech is more difficult than other sectors. It seems to me that most people start on the journey of solving a problem in health because of either something they've gone through themselves or someone they know has gone through, or something that they've seen as a clinician, and therefore their internal drive and motivation is so different than financial. And so I think that's the same for a lot of us, you know. I think there's always the element of needing to get by and starting a business that gets you by and puts food on the table and the rest of it. But I think beyond that, I think so many people in health, and it's a nice thing about health, is that a lot of people are kind of inherently motivated by putting good vibes out there and being impact driven, which is great, and that's why I enjoy it, and I enjoy getting that feedback.
I guess speaking of ideas, then, so imagine if Secretary of State for Health came up to you and said, I'm going to give you £100,000. I'm going to cut all the red tape for you. No problem with that side of things. But you have to spend that money on health tech. How would you do it?
You know what? It's such a difficult question. There's so many things that I would do. I suppose ultimately, what we would need to do, what I'd probably spend that money either bribing or lobbying, if you want to be politically correct, to change the incentives. What I would want is to allow there to be more incentives for people to take risk. And what I mean by that is one of the biggest barriers that I think to adoption of health tech, and actually startups getting in and technology companies getting in and making a difference, is that on the demand side, i.e. on the hospital side, the department side, the GP, like the primary care, like on that side, people aren't incentivized to take risk. Be that through concern about patient harm, but also concern about, is this going to make my day way more busy and worse? And is it not going to work? Am I going to have to learn a new system? All those different things. So what I'd probably do is use, in fact, here's a politically correct way of putting it. I'd use that money to start a fund or a pot of money that would be used to kind of give people the financial incentive to adopt new technology and to try new technology. So it would be, try this new technology and have 100 grand, whether it works or not. Something like that. Because actually, I think that is going to incentivize people to act, and it's the teach a man to fish rather than, you know, giving them the fish, right? And I think that's the point. I think if we could do that across the board, it'd actually make a difference.
I don't think anyone's ever given me that answer before. So after asking that question numerous times, that was the first time I had that kind of answer. So thank you for that. Actually,
that's all right.
I'm
a bit weird. Sorry.
How nice would that be to take away the risk element of trying something new? Because then actually, that's often the barrier, isn't it? It's the fear of, what if this fails? What if this creates, like you say, more work for me down the line? Having some of that backed up to just say, actually, we can make it a bit easier for you. I think that would absolutely lead to a better adoption of, potentially some really cool stuff out there. So I guess sharing that kind of stuff, if people did want to track up what you're doing and how you're doing and stuff, where would you suggest that they go have a look?
So there is, the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn. So James Somauroo, so Somauroo. That's definitely the best way. So you can follow me on there, you can add me. There's at James Somauroo on Twitter. There is the podcast, which is called the Health-Tech podcast, because it was before Healthtech was one word. I might change that at some point. There is the newsletter, Healthtech Pidgeon, so you can go to healthtechpigeon.com and subscribe to that newsletter. But yeah, find me on LinkedIn, ping me if you want me, and yeah, I'm usually pretty responsive.
No problems. And for those of you watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast, just check out the show notes and stuff. All those links will be there for you and things. Thank you for joining us, James. I know I've enjoyed this, and I know that in terms of content and stuff, absolutely agree with on what, pretty much everything you said there in terms of how people can get started. And if they do want to get started, absolutely just literally pick up a mic, pick up a laptop, and get cracking. Really, because it's so much fun when you get started.
Yeah, go to anchor.fm and just hit record and you're away.
Definitely. So, EGP players, I hope you've enjoyed this episode with myself and James. We talked about basically how to start a podcast, but also why you should do one, and more importantly, just learning about him and the Health Tech podcast and some of the cool things that are really out there. As always, if you want to join us, feel free to contact me, whichever platform you prefer: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, yada, yada, yada. Make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. Always like hearing from all of you. And as always, EGP Lane is here to help save you and your patients time by taking answer in your primary care and learning. And catch you in the next episode.